This is BBC World News. I'm Nuala McGovern. Our top stories. NATO Secretary-General says it's up to Russia to decide whether to pursue a diplomatic approach to Ukraine or one of confrontation. We report from the front line in eastern Ukraine, where government forces are fighting Russian-backed separatists.
This is about more than the future of Ukraine. It's about the future shape of NATO, about the security of Europe. Battle lines are being drawn now in a new Cold War.
North Korea has carried out its biggest missile launch in years, sending an intermediate-range weapon 2,000 kilometres into space. The Northern Irish city of Londonderry commemorates the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when British soldiers opened fire on a peaceful civil rights march. Also on the programme, Rafael Nadal makes history with Grand Slam 21 after an amazing comeback in Melbourne. Hello and welcome to BBC World News. As tensions over Ukraine continue, NATO Secretary-General has said it's up to Russia to decide whether to pursue a diplomatic path offered by Western powers or one of confrontation over Ukraine. Russia denies planning to invade Ukraine, that is despite having stationed large numbers of troops around its borders and also annexed in Crimea. In return, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused the West of infringing Russia's security.
We want good, mutually respectful and equal relations with the United States and as well as any other country in the world. But taught by bitter experience, we do not want to remain in a position where our security is infringed daily. Each time it turns out that NATO defense lines continues to move eastwards. Now it has come close to Ukraine. They also want to drag Ukraine into NATO. Although it's clear to everyone that Ukraine is not ready and will not make any contribution to strengthening NATO's security.
Earlier, NATO Secretary-General Stoltenberg said they were pursuing a balanced approach in the face of a real danger that Russia could invade Ukraine. From the front line, our international correspondent Orla Guerin has the latest.
On the frozen front lines of eastern Ukraine, it's heads down in the trenches to avoid sniper fire. Maria is following in the footsteps of her military father. She keeps watch for the enemy, separatists backed by Moscow, who seized territory here 8 years ago. If Russia invades, she'll be facing far worse. Do you believe the Russians are coming? I try to avoid politics, she says. Psychologically, I try not to get worried. We've heard about their military build-up, but if they try to break through, we will be ready. Troops here say they are not on a higher level of alert. So far, they stress, there's nothing to see here. A view echoed by the government in Kiev. These front lines haven't moved in years, but the fear is there could soon be a much bigger conflict here. And this is about more than the future of Ukraine. It's about the future shape of NATO, about the security of Europe. Battle lines are being drawn now in a new Cold War. For now, all's quiet on the Eastern Front. And Moscow continues to deny it will invade. But is this the calm before the storm? Some here know only too well what Russia and its allies can do. Shelling by separatists last November destroyed Ludmila Momot's home of 30 years. She's come back to show us the wreckage. And she had this plea for President Putin.
Примиріться, примиріться, договоріться.
Make peace. Reach an agreement. You're all adults, educated people. Make peace so that people can live freely, without tears and suffering.
Спокійно.
This might be just a foretaste of what's ahead. The international warnings are stark. President Biden says a Russian invasion would change the world. Only Vladimir Putin knows what's coming in his modern-day version of war and peace. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Eastern Ukraine.
Well, let's get more on the situation in Ukraine now from our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette from Kiev.
All the moves are being watched most closely of all here in Ukraine, especially that new message from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who's dealt time and again with Russia, and again saying it is up to Moscow to decide whether or not it will choose a diplomatic path. NATO, like the Ukrainians, hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. So what could lie ahead? For some assessments, we're joined here by Alexander Danyuk, who was the former head of Ukraine's Security and Defense Council, also a former finance minister. Welcome to the program.
Good evening.
You have looked at this dossier so closely for so long. Is it possible that there can be common ground between NATO and Russia when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, it's difficult to envisage any common ground. Clearly, there is no common ground between Ukraine and Russia, because Russia deliberately kind of trying to exclude Ukraine from any negotiations, trying to, to talk directly to the United States, to NATO, but just making sure that Ukraine almost like doesn't exist. Between Russia and NATO, I think also a similar position. I think Putin raised stakes so high that's actually almost impossible to find common grounds.
Because of all the troops that he's massed on the border and the heavy weaponry?
Exactly, and in terms of his rhetorics, he used a very, ultimatum-like rhetorics. And I think this is his miscalculation. He thought originally that the West will show weakness. And even I remember originally there was this, during the meeting with Biden, first phone calls, there was this thinking that maybe US already showed some weakness, agreeing to some negotiations, but actually it turned out to be not true. And now what Putin sees is very kind of strong reaction from the West, because everyone is firm. Biden is firm. He cannot afford to show any weakness because of just even because of the internal situation in the United States. Similar situation in the United Kingdom. So I think Putin realized that it's he believes himself there is no common ground. And that actually makes it very, very risky, because stakes are getting higher and higher and higher on all sides.
Yes, and as you say, both President Putin and President Biden can't afford to lose.
Yeah.
And yet, President Zelensky has been saying, calm down. The situation now is no worse than it was a year ago. You know him, you've worked with him closely. Do you agree with him?
Well, he chose this rhetorics, and that rhetorics
is it rhetoric or is it reality?
That's no, it's rhetorics. It's rhetorics, and it's the audience for this rhetorics is actually domestic audience, not Western audience, not Russia. And I think it's also a wrong message, because West just doesn't understand this. Because, well, look, they see the reality. They see what's happening on the borders. They see the request of our government for military support, for financial support. Why these requests are coming? Because we need this. We understand the urgency. And yet, when President Zelensky speaks to the public about the West, he pretends like nothing is happening.
Although he did, to be fair, he did say that there was a threat from the border, but he just couldn't say whether a war was certain.
Well, nobody can say whether the war is certain or not.
If you just judge it by the...
I think it's irresponsible to make any predictions on that. As a former national security chief, who knows the situation quite well, I just assess what's happening on the border. I assess the capacity, the ability of Russia to attack. But what is really important is intelligence, whether they will do it or won't.
Do you think that intelligence exists? As many say that even President Putin doesn't know what he's going to do.
Well, you see,
you've studied
I think the intelligence says that Putin made his mind about attacking. Otherwise, I have no explanation for reaction of Putin and for reaction of the West. So this tells me that there is some intelligence. This is the most this is priceless, really.
So what kind of form do you think it will take? Because there's some assessment that it won't be a full frontal assault. He'll try for some kind of an incursion, perhaps into the east, or perhaps even across the Belarusian border.
Look, I have my strong views. I don't believe in small incursions because the cost of these incursions will be very high for Putin. Sanctions, military response, and yet as a trophy, like a couple more square kilometers, as a trophy, it means nothing to Russia. So I'm afraid the biggest risk is actually there could be a large-scale war. The question is how probable it is. I think it's not very probable, but returning to what I said, all parties raising their stakes. And it could be in this game of stakes, a very dangerous game, it could be a situation where Putin just have no choice but actually to press the button. And that is the biggest concern for everyone, I believe, whether it's talking to, whether it's even Zelensky. Even Zelensky thinks about this, although publicly says totally different.
The stakes are very high when Jens Stoltenberg says prepare for the worst. You're outlining what the worst could be. Alexander Daniluk, thank you very much for sharing your very close-up assessments of what could possibly happen here across the borders in Ukraine with the massing of more than 100,000 Russian troops and with every day more heavy weaponry. As he underlined, neither President Putin or President Biden wants to lose. Most of all, Ukrainians don't want to keep losing either.
Thanks so much to Lise Doucette from Kiev. Let's take a look then at some of the day's other news. One person is reported to have been killed